Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to review part 1 of photosynthesis, respiration, and translocation. So we'll start with photosynthesis in particular, as photosynthesis is one part, respiration is another, and translocation is a different part. These are all separate, mutually exclusive. So we're first starting with photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process of converting light energy to chemical energy, by definition, in the form of reduced carbon compounds. So what photosynthesis entails is taking carbon dioxide plus water, and with the use of light energy, we create sugar and oxygen. This entire PowerPoint will break down what this exactly means. This process of converting carbon dioxide and water into sugar and carbohydrate, sugar being the carbohydrate and oxygen, that is photosynthesis. This equation sums up photosynthesis. If I showed you this equation and I said, what is this? You would say photosynthesis. Whenever referring to C6H12O6 right here where it says sugar, for simplicity, I might say sugar, carbohydrate, or glucose. If we're being particular, it is specifically glucose, C6H12O6, because there are different types of sugars. You can have sucrose, galactose, fructose, glucose. There are different kinds. So this image down here, this can be broken down into different, if we want to be picky, different parts. But that would be more of a food science class. For simplicity, we're just gonna say, whenever I'm saying sugar, carbohydrate, glucose, I am referring to C6H12O6. So we're gonna start getting a bit more in depth. The equation below is a very simplified of what really happens in photosynthesis. This equation is the basics. This is simply stating a chemical equation. Think of chemistry. This is the chemical equation, but it's not the full explanation. But we'll continue to explain where these different parts of this equation come from, because they don't all happen in the same area. One part happens in one area, the other part happens in another area. So in plants, photosynthesis occurs inside the chloroplast. Remember, the chloroplasts are found inside cells, and they are green in color. This right here is a chloroplast. It is the green round part that you've seen on the different models that we've had in class. This is it. So on average, there are between 30 and 40 chloroplasts in one photosynthesizing cell. There can be less, there can be more. It can depend on the life. Are we heading towards dormancy where the leaves are going yellow or red? That means there's less chloroplasts and more anthocyanins. So it depends on where we are in the life of the plant, but on average, that means some plants can have more than 40, some plants might have less. If there's a green leaf, then that's where you find chloroplasts. Plain and simple. If you have a leaf that's green, you then remember, this would be a dicot. Here are the palisade mesophyll. And then inside the cells that are green, you're going to have chloroplasts right here. And then there are different parts within the chloroplasts. So today we're going to be focusing on the inside of the chloroplasts. The inside. So first we're going to review the different parts of the chloroplast. Just how we reviewed the different parts of a cell, we have the same thing. We are going to review the different parts of a chloroplast. So you have the chloroplast membrane. This is the outer membrane and the inner membrane and the inner membrane. So intermembrane and inner membrane. These are all individual. These 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. Just like a plant cell has the three different, middle lamella, primary, and secondary cell wall, same concept. We have the outer, the intermembrane space, and the inner membrane. So the outer membrane is going to be just this outside part. The intermembrane space is the space between the inner membrane and the outer membrane. So it's going to be liquid or air. It's just the space in between, denoted by the word space right here. Then you have the inner membrane. The membranes encompass the stroma. The stroma, just jumping ahead, the stroma is the aqueous fluid inside. So the membranes encompass the stroma, which is saying that these membranes hold in the stroma. It holds in the liquid. That is their purpose. That is to prevent the stroma from flowing into the rest of the cell. Because remember, a chloroplast is just one part of a cell. You also have the nucleus. You might have the endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, or aka dictosome. This is just one part of cells. So the chloroplast membrane holds in all the inside parts of a chloroplast. And the structure is a phospholipid bilayer. We have talked about this before. The nucleus has a phospholipid bilayer. The mitochondria has a phospholipid bilayer. This is, remember, this is a characteristic in eukaryotic cells. So then the first thing we're going to do is go through the stroma. The stroma is the inner liquid that the granum are surrounded by. Now, what's a granum? Great question. Granum are defined as being stacks of thylakoids. So it kind of builds on each other. So a granum is going to be this whole stack right here, the whole thing. It's like a stack of pancakes, essentially. Thylakoids are one individual disc, just one disc. So multiple thylakoids make a granum. The granum are floating or being encompassed by the stroma, which is the aqueous fluid. The thylakoid lumen is the space inside the thylakoid, is denoted by the red. So it is the space inside. So it's like the inside of the pancake. And the thylakoid membrane, so you have the thylakoid lumen, but you also have the thylakoid membrane. It is the outer layer that encompasses the thylakoid lumen. So just like you have an outer membrane of the chloroplasts, it has the outer membrane right here. The thylakoid also has an outer membrane as well. And that is the thylakoid membrane. So hopefully you guys aren't getting confused. It might just take a little bit of practice to get this down. So you have the thylakoid, which is just one disc. The thylakoid also has a thylakoid lumen. And it also has a thylakoid membrane. The membrane holds in the lumen because the lumen is the inside of the thylakoid, which is the red. It's the red. Okay, so then we have chlorophyll. Don't confuse chlorophyll with chloroplast. Chloroplast is the whole shebang. That's the whole shebang. The chlorophyll is within the membrane of the thylakoid. So now we're talking about the thylakoid membrane, not the red, but the outside membrane of one single thylakoid. There's pigment, which is color. And that's where the green comes from. The green comes from the thylakoid membrane because that is where you find the pigment chlorophyll. And then a pigment is just a color. So chlorophyll, we just kind of went big and now we're going down small. Here is the molecular structure of chlorophyll. So you have a leaf. Inside a leaf, you have inside a leaf cell, you have a chloroplast. And then within a chloroplast, you have, remember, a thylakoid. And then within the thylakoid membrane, you have chlorophyll. The thylakoid membrane is what contains the pigment chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the pigment found in certain living creatures and all green plants. Yes, creatures, because there are creatures out there that have that contain chlorophyll. So whenever you see algae that has chlorophyll, there's some bacteria that have chlorophyll as well. Chlorophyll is needed for the photosynthesis process. So chlorophyll is specifically for photosynthesis. So if you look at a chlorophyll and then you look at a hemoglobin in the human blood, they're not much different. They're very, very alike. Pretty much the biggest difference between a chlorophyll molecule and a hemoglobin is the center. For chlorophyll, it has magnesium, but for a hemoglobin, which is it's part of the human blood, the middle is iron. So that is the biggest difference between chlorophyll and hemoglobin. But through evolution, humans we came from plants at one point. We evolved from plants. So it would make sense that there's not much difference because we evolved from plants. So therefore, there was already existing characteristics. And this is one. Instead of a magnesium, there's an iron. So photosynthesis happens anywhere on the plant that is green. It's not just in the leaves. So if you have a stem that's green, does it photosynthesize? Yes. If there's roots that are green, does it photosynthesize? Yes. Orchids have green roots, and that is because they are meant to photosynthesize as well. So photosynthesis is a two-step process. That's how we'll break this down. The first step in photosynthesis takes place on the thylakoid membrane. Remember, you have the thylakoid. It is one single pancake. On that thylakoid, you have you have the lumen, which is inside. The outside, that encompassing phospholipid bilayer, is the membrane, the thylakoid membrane. So the first part of photosynthesis takes place on the thylakoid, on it. Not in the lumen, but on the thylakoid membrane. And the second step of photosynthesis takes place in the stroma, the aqueous fluid inside of a chloroplast. That's where the second step. So when we're talking about the first step of photosynthesis, you think thylakoid membrane because that's where it's happening. The second step, you think stroma, the aqueous fluid just inside of the chloroplast, hanging out inside. That's where the second step takes place. So step one of photosynthesis that happens in the thylakoid membrane is the light reaction. The light reaction can also be called the light-dependent reaction. Key word being dependent. That is because this reaction cannot happen without light. Therefore, if I asked you a question of, hey, step one in photosynthesis, is this light dependent? The answer is yes. Or does this reaction rely on light to happen, to occur? Yes, that's true. So that is step one. Right here, if there is no light, this process cannot happen. The second part of photosynthesis happens inside the stroma. Remember, that is the liquid that is inside of the chloroplast. So this picture is depicting a chloroplast as a whole, and then you have the stroma that's happening inside. I actually really like this photo because it is depicting both parts of photosynthesis, part 1 and part 2. So part 2 is named the Calvin cycle, or it can also be referred to as the dark reaction or the light independent reaction. So please remember there are 3 names for part 2 or step 2. Calvin cycle, dark reaction, or light independent reaction. And I really want to highlight the independent part. This tells you that step 2 that happens inside the stroma does not need light to occur. Unlike step 1, it is light dependent. Step 2 is light independent. So step 1, light has to have light. There has to be light, sunlight. We're talking sunlight or even, bulbs, something like that. There needs to be light. And then step 2 is independent. It can happen without light being present. So in this photo, you have the light dependent reaction, which is, my apologies, step 1. And this is happening inside the thylakoid. And then you have step 2, the Calvin cycle, aka dark reaction, aka light independent reaction, step 2. So dark reaction is just a great way to say light independent reaction. It can happen in the dark. It does not mean it only has to happen in the dark. What this means is that light does not need to be present. So if I asked you a question on an exam that said, the step 2 in photosynthesis can only occur in the dark, if that was true or false, you would say false. It doesn't only have to occur in the dark. It just does not need light as a way for the process to work. And you'll see this in the light reaction right now. You'll see why there has to be light. So we're first going to focus on step 1. So part 1 of photosynthesis, the light reaction, part 1 of photosynthesis, takes place in the thylakoid membrane. Remember, the thylakoid membrane. Step 2 is the stroma. The first step is thylakoid membrane. This right here, this awesome picture, this is the thylakoid membrane. The thylakoid membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid bilayer. So remember, it has the heads, which is the hydrophobic end. Hydrophobic. And then remember, the tails are hydrophilic. So this is a phospholipid bilayer. The thylakoid membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, which is a characteristic of eukaryotes because they have membrane-bound organelles. So next part. The top of this image represents the stroma. So we have this nice little name right here, stroma. This part and up, this is the stroma. Underneath this membrane is the thylakoid lumen. So let's go back to this image. So we're in one of these stacks. We're going to draw this stack up here. It's like a disc. It's a pancake. This outer red line that I just drew, that is the membrane. The inside is the lumen. So let's go back to this image. This outer part right here, all of this outer part, this is the stroma. This inner part right here, this is the inside of the thylakoid, which is the lumen. So we will be going through these different parts where this picture is going to keep popping up. Right here is the thylakoid membrane. Right here. Thylakoid membrane is this whole part. Then you have the thylakoid lumen, and then you have the stroma. Don't forget, part 1 of photosynthesis happens on the thylakoid membrane. So the first part is oxygen is created from the splitting of water right down here. So you have water right here. It splits into oxygen and hydrogen ions. These are H+. So splitting of water is 2 hydrogen molecules. This is an H+, and there's 2 of these. And then 1 oxygen molecule, or half of a dioxygen. So that is where this 1/2 over 1/2 oxygen comes in. So the first part is the splitting of water. And this happens right here. Right on, it's going to be inside. Remember, this is the lumen. So this happens inside the lumen. Remember, this side is the stroma, the liquid of the inside of a chloroplast. So the energy behind splitting of the water is from the sun. This is characterized by this little lightning bolt. This is why step 1, part 1, is light dependent. Because to split water, you need light. This is characterized by light. So the sun's energy is used to split the water. Okay, now for the second part of part 1, we're at NADP gains a hydrogen molecule, turning it into NADPH. For simplicity, we are not going to review this part. This is just a little bit more, it's just not needed for this class. So remember, part 1 was splitting of water into oxygen and a proton, a hydrogen proton. Now we're going into NADP plus gains a hydrogen, turning it into NADPH. The H in NADPH means hydrogen. So that H quite literally means gaining a hydrogen. NADPH is chemical energy. So the sun is light energy. Sun equals light energy. And NADPH is chemical energy. And you need to know that distinct difference. NADP plus, you add a hydrogen, turns it into NADPH. NADPH. So right here, a hydrogen is added to NADP, and you get NADPH. How? How does that happen? How does it gain a hydrogen? It doesn't just happen out of thin air. No, what happened is light energy. Look at the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt right here, that is depicting light energy from the sun. Light energy gave that reaction the energy needed to bond that hydrogen to NADPH. So again, in part 1, when we split, that was from, the energy came from light. There has to be energy for these processes to occur. The energy has to come from somewhere. Part 1, splitting of water, came from the sun. Part 2, which is NADP plus gaining a hydrogen into NADPH, that also came from the sun as well. So both of these processes use the sun's energy to make it happen. So the next part, third part, is ADP gains of phosphorus, which can be also denoted as Pi. The molecule turns into ATP. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate, and right here, adenosine diphosphate. And when you gain a phosphorus, it turns into adenosine triphosphate. So think of word parts. Di means 2. Tri, like tricycle, means 3. So because of the addition of the phosphorus, you turn ADP into ATP. ATP is chemical energy, just like NADPH, NADPH, and ATP both equal chemical energy. They're both chemical energy. Light, what is light? The sun, may I say? The sun, what type of energy is that? You're right. It is light energy. All right, so the energy behind the gaining of the phosphorus molecule is from the hydrogen gradient. So what this is stating is that there are more hydrogen molecules inside the thylakoid lumen. Remember, this right here is this side of the thylakoid membrane is the inside of the thylakoid, which is the lumen, thylakoid lumen. So there was more hydrogen inside the lumen than there was outside. When there is a gradient like that, there wants to be an equilibrium. So that equilibrium, because there's so many hydrogen inside the lumen, think of so many hydrogen, and there's not enough outside. Look, it's empty. There's nothing. Nada. No hydrogen. It causes the hydrogen to want to go and get to the other side, so there is an equilibrium. And so this is called ATP synthase. When the ADP gains a phosphorus and it turns into ATP, that process on the light-dependent reaction is called ATP synthase. And so that is from a hydrogen gradient, because there's more hydrogen in the lumen than there was in the stroma. Remember, the top part of this is depicting the stroma. This is the stroma, this whole outside. So we're going to review the first step, or the first part of photosynthesis, the light reaction, the light-dependent reaction. This reaction will only occur when there is light. Where does it happen? On the thylakoid membrane. What happens? First, water is split because of light energy. This splitting of water creates hydrogen molecules and oxygen. The next part, part 2, NADP plus is turned into NADPH because it gains a hydrogen molecule, and that was due to light energy. Remember the thunderbolt? That was light energy. NADPH is chemical energy. That is chemical energy. The sun is light energy. And then the third part, light energy, or energy from the hydrogen gradient, turns ADP into ATP. And this was through ATP synthase. ATP synthase. That is what the process is called when ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is turned into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP, again, is chemical energy, and so is NADPH. All right, now we're going to go into part 2, which happens inside the stroma. So we just had part 1, which was the thylakoid membrane. Now we're going on to part 2, which happens inside the stroma. This part is called the Calvin cycle, the dark reaction, or the light independent reaction. That is because this does not involve light. It does not. Just in the first part, we talked about light is needed for NADPH. Light is needed for ATP. Light is not needed inside the Calvin cycle. It doesn't give energy. So part 2 of photosynthesis. The light reaction, part 1 of photosynthesis, part 2, happens inside the stroma of the chloroplast. That is the liquid inside the chloroplast. So this is part 2 right here. This is part 2, this whole thing. See these little stamps? That's the stroma. This is signifying that this is all happening inside the stroma. So part 2, in the Calvin cycle, there's carbon dioxide, which is CO2, ATP, and NADPH are used to create sugar. So remember in part 1, what was created was ATP and NADPH. So part 1. So what was used? H2O. What was created was ATP and NADPH. Used, water. Created, ATP and NADPH. Okay, so carbon dioxide came from the atmosphere. So inside the part 2, the Calvin cycle, it uses carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide comes in right here at the top. It's 3 carbon dioxides come in. So remember, think back to, pause this, go back. If I were you, I would write down the photosynthesis equation. This should be making sense. Remember, the photosynthesis equation is water plus carbon dioxide creates sugars and oxygen. We have used up now 3 parts of that equation. First part, remember, it was water plus CO2 create C6H12O6 plus O2. So this one, water, happened in the part 1, and O2 was in part 1 too, as well. Part 1, water and oxygen. Remember, the water was split. It was the first step. It created hydrogen and oxygen. Now we're on to part 2, which we just talked about. There's the carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide came from the atmosphere, which is the air we breathe, and it enters through, and remember that CO2 originally entered the cell through the stomata. Remember the stomatal pores? Those are on the surface of the leaf. You then have the plant cell, which has a chloroplast inside of it. So that carbon dioxide went inside the stomata, into the plant cell, diffused into the plant cell, which then went inside of the chloroplast, and it's now in the stroma because remember, the Calvin cycle happens inside the stroma. So the ATP and the NADPH both come from the light reaction. So in this process, it's going to use up part 2 uses ATP and NADPH. That is how part 1 and part 2 of photosynthesis take care of each other. Part 1 creates the ATP and NADPH from light energy. Part 2, the Calvin cycle, now uses up that energy. Think of it as a battery. Part 1 charged those batteries. You had ATP, let's think of it as a AAA battery, and NADPH is like a D volt battery. ATP doesn't have as much energy as an NADPH. It is a lesser form. It's not as strong. So we think of that as like a AAA battery. We want to think of NADPH as like a D volt, which those are those big ones that if you like put your tongue on them, it will shock you. Think of it as that. Part 1 charges them from the sun, from light energy. They get charged. They get zapped full of energy because of the sun energy. In part 2, they are used up. They go empty. They then get shelled back to part 1 to get charged up. And then they go and get used up in the Calvin cycle, part 2. Do you see how they're bouncing back and forth? So part 1 and part 2 essentially work together. So the ATP and NADPH both came from the light reaction. And now they're going to be used up in the Calvin cycle. So right here, you can see the ATP get turned into ADP. They get emptied. They're used up. And so are the NADPH. They get used up into NADP plus. They get emptied. Why that happened is it turned the 3 carbon dioxide into 6,3-PGA. You don't need to know what PGA technically means. It's a conversion. The molecules, take like the alphabet, take all the numbers, what happened, or all the letters, take the alphabet, mix all the letters together so you have Z in the front and X in the front and A in the back. What happens is the ATP and the NADPH used up their energy because they're like batteries to then reconfigure the alphabet into A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It back into the order it should be. That is kind of what happens with these carbon dioxide. These 3 carbon dioxide, they get reordered into 6,3-PGA. So that is what the ATP and the NADPH were used up for. It was to reconfigure these molecules. They get moved around. So then they get reduced, which you don't need to know. They then turn into RUBP, which you don't really need to know. And then the cycle continues. This is a true cycle. It keeps going round and round and round and round. It is very cyclical. It's a conversion of energy. And this is something you would learn more about this in a different class. But you just know that in the Calvin cycle, it uses up carbon dioxide. It uses up the ATP from part 1 and the NADPH, part 1, and then it creates the sugars. Here's the sugars right here at the bottom. This is our C6H12O6. That's what's created. So quickly, we'll review this. The Calvin cycle, or the light independent reaction, it does not need light to happen. That's not part of what makes this work. It happens in the stroma. And remember, this is the liquid of the chloroplast, inside the chloroplast. So the combination of carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH together create sugar. CO2 from this enters through the stomata of the leaves, maybe the stem. You don't know, but it enters through. The ATP and NADPH are used up and then turned back into ADP, diphosphate, and NADP plus. And then they go back to part 1 to get recharged. And then NADPH and ATP, that should be a T, are both chemical energy. Let's do a review real quick. You need to be able to answer these questions for an exam. Here is the photosynthesis equation. You have carbon dioxide plus water creates sugar and oxygen. Where did the C6H12O6, where is that being used? Well, first, let's say, where did it come from? Where did it come from? Part 1 or part 2? It came from part 2. And part 2 is the Calvin cycle. So, where is it being used? When I ask this question is, where is it being used in the plant? Well, sugar is used to grow fruit. That's the sugar we taste in an apple. It grows new leaves. It grows new roots. It grows new stems, new petals. It's used up in the plant. Sugar to a plant is money for us. We use money to live our day-to-day. That is our currency, dollar bills. That, for a plant, is sugar. C6H12 is created in photosynthesis, but specifically what part? And I will ask you this. That is part 2. Or Calvin cycle. What's the other names for it? Dark reaction, light independent reaction. If C6H12O6 is used for synthesizing other products stored in leaves, roots, or fruits, or used in respiration to create more energy, that's another point. It can be used in respiration, which you learn that's the next part we'll go over. So it's photosynthesis, respiration, and translocation. Respiration is next. It can also be used in respiration as well. So let's ask this. Where did the carbon dioxide in this equation, was that a part of part 1 or part 2 of photosynthesis? That was part of part 2. Remember in the Calvin cycle, it was right at the top, right here. There's 3 of them. Water. Whoa, where was that a part of this equation? Part 1 or part 2? Remember, that was from part 1. That was the splitting of water. Created a half of dioxide and 2 hydrogen protons. And then sugar came from part 3. What about oxygen? Where did that come from? Well, I kind of just explained it. That was part 1. Part 1. That's when the splitting of the water. You get that oxygen. So the light reaction plus the Calvin cycle equals photosynthesis. Part 1, part 2 equals photosynthesis. So this picture, I really like this photo because this shows how cellular respiration and photosynthesis work together. And you will go over respiration, but please know that going into cellular respiration, just like part 1 and part 2 of photosynthesis, let's take a step back. Part 1 and part 2, they fed each other, right? Part 1 and part 2 fed each other. What did they feed each other? Well, in part 1, it created ATP and NADPH. Part 2, use those up. Remember, think of these as batteries. They were used up. So the same kind of thing happens when you look at photosynthesis as a whole and cellular respiration as a whole. Photosynthesis creates products. What were those 2 products? We just reviewed them. Sugar and oxygen. Those were the 2 products being created in photosynthesis. Well, those 2 products, oxygen and sugar from photosynthesis, are used up in cellular respiration. They're used up. They feed them. They feed cellular respiration. Cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide and water. Is this starting to sound familiar? Carbon dioxide plus water equals O2 plus glucose. That is this equation right here. So looking at a large step back, when you look at photosynthesis and cell respiration, they feed each other. Light energy goes into photosynthesis, and mitochondria, it uses up chemical energy. So we're going to dive deeper into cellular respiration, but just know that photosynthesis and respiration go hand in hand just as much as part 1 and part 2 of photosynthesis go hand in hand. So what is this picture I'm looking at? What are these green things? I hope you know this. This is something we will have already reviewed, but these are stomata. The green things are the chloroplasts. That hole in the middle is the stomatal aperture. What's going in and out? Well, what's going into those is carbon dioxide. What's going out? Oxygen. That is how we have the oxygen we breathe. You can think plants. You can also, algae. Algae does actually the most of the creation of carbon dioxide. The whole thing about the Amazon rainforest isn't all the way true. It's mostly algae actually in the ocean. But here's another picture that we have carbon dioxide going out, but we also do have water as well, because respiration creates water. This is actually from respiration. This is a product of respiration. This is a product of photosynthesis. But we will review that. We'll review respiration next. So what goes in? Carbon dioxide. If there's a closed stomata, right here, nothing's going in, nothing's going out. So you can pause this. This reiterates part 1 and part 2 in writing. Go ahead and pause this and read it if you need to. Also here, you can pause this. This is a photosynthesis. A photosynthesis in summary, explaining that sugars are transported to be used. The sugars created in photosynthesis, C6H12O6, those sugars are going to be used to grow roots, to grow leaves, to grow stem. Most of it is done from the algae in the ocean. Do not forget that. Although plants are important, most photosynthesis on Earth is from microorganisms and algae in the ocean. That is very, very important. And carbohydrates are an energy source for plants. This carbon dioxide, good Lord, carbohydrates are an energy source. Carbon dioxide helps feed that energy source, because remember, carbon dioxide is used in photosynthesis to create the sugar.